Today we are talking to Australian author about his novel, An Australian Story.
Gordon, where do you prefer to compose most of your writing?
I prefer to compose and formulate my stories away from the hustle and bustle of the world. My preferred location is overlooking the Coral Sea at Kings Beach or Shelley Beach at Caloundra on Queensland's Sunshine Coast.
What inspired you to write an Australian story?
After the success of my first book, The Family That Went to War, I decided to follow on with a book on my family during World War II. My initial thought was to write a book about the members of my family who fought in World War II, like a continuation that followed on from The Family That Went to War.
And when did you decide on the subject?
Once I started to research the war diaries from World War II, I realized that there was a bigger story, so instead of a story on World War II, I opted for a semi-biography of my family from their first arrival in Australia up until the death of my mother 200 years later. The research threw up so many stories of history, tragedy, joy, and pure interest that I began to realize what an epic story I had stumbled upon. I knew from my schooling most of the history that was eventually included in the story, but it was the research that threw up the many stories of my family throughout the 2 centuries. Once I gathered all the research together, I started to weave the family research into the actual history of Australia. I was amazed in how much of the family was involved in the making of Australia as we know it. The research into the military records amazed me. I knew little of my family during World War II, and the stories were awesome. My father never talked much about his war service. He occasionally mentioned places but never his involvement. The same applied to the remainder of the family, other than from some obscure references while I was growing up. As an example, we knew that one of my mother's brothers was missing in action. When I examined the records, I discovered that he, in fact, had been a prisoner of war and eventually passed away during the horrendous, infamous Sandakan Death March.
Gordon, how did you decide on the title?
I thought of many different titles, but after rereading the finished story I settled on An Australian Story, as it is in fact a story of Australia over the first 2 centuries of European settlement.
Now tell me, how did you decide on the length of your story?
I had not given any thought to the size of the story, however, it became obvious to me that the book needs to be divided into chapters and sections. My final decision was to divide the result into several books based on time or family sections. These books were then divided in turn, into historical events or the individual family members' stories.
What do you consider the strongest, most emotional phrase in the story?
The remainder was so weak and helpless from dysentery, that an attempt was made to segregate them, by allotting them the area below the floor into which they were able to crawl. As the problem of burying the dead increased, the Japanese opened a new cemetery about 20 yards from the prisoner's hut. On Friday the 20th of July 1945, Charles Gilbert Roy Power, known as Roy, passed away.
Thank you for your time today. An Australian Story is available in both paperback and ebook formats from Amazon. You can explore An Australian Story on Amazon.